Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully you've all had a good day so far. So I was asked to talk about advances in treatment of ovarian cancer and current clinical trials that are available. So hopefully I'll cover the sort of information that you want, but obviously you can ask any questions that you might like to at the end. So as stated, I treat patients at the Mater and the PA hospital. The Mater hospital is a big gynecological centre. So we certainly see lots of patients with ovarian cancer there. So just to clarify, because I think it's important to just clarify at the beginning that not all ovarian cancer is the same entity. And certainly, we may have potentially women with different types of cancer in the room, but certainly epithelial ovarian cancer accounts for the great majority of ovarian cancer that we see. So that includes low-grade serous, high-grade serous, which is absolutely the most common. So that would be at least 85% of all ovarian cancer that we would actually see in clinical practice. Some rarer histopathological subtypes, endometrioid, mucinous and clear cell, and then there's the non-epithelial ovarian cancer group, which tends to happen in younger women. So that includes the germ cell cancers and the sex cord stromal tumours. And so just to clarify where they're all coming from, they're coming from different parts of the ovary. So it's that surface epithelium where the majority of the ovarian cancers come from. So because the high-grade serous epithelial ovarian cancer is absolutely the most common, that's where most of the clinical trial research is. So most of what I'll talk about today will actually be in that setting, just because that's what's most common. And so I apologise if I've left anyone out, and we can ask specifically about subtypes if you wanted to. So what I thought I would do, just to sort of bring you up to speed with where we've got to, is sort of just cover what the various steps have been in the development of treatment of ovarian cancer. So for high-grade serous ovarian cancer, surgery is absolutely one of the most critical parts of treatment. And that's what your ultimate aim is. If you can achieve surgical resection, that's where you're trying to get to for patients in the beginning. So there's this concept of optimal versus suboptimal debulking that perhaps people may have heard about, and trying to achieve optimal debulking is definitely better than suboptimal debulking in terms of improving survival, which seems very intuitive and sensible. That's fairly obvious, isn't it? So when people are first diagnosed with ovarian cancer, because it tends to be at a much higher stage, so stage 3 and stage 4 would be where the majority of ovarian cancer is diagnosed, just because, as you probably read about, it tends to present with symptoms quite late in the staging of the disease rather than earlier on. One of the considerations is surgery an option up front, and do the surgeons think that they can resect all of the disease? And if they think that they can, then they'll go on and do surgery. But unfortunately, because women often have quite advanced disease at diagnosis, surgical resection with optimal debulking may not be surgically feasible. And so they'll often refer for what we call neoadjuvant chemotherapy before surgery to try and downstage, shrink the cancer and make an optimal debulking a more likely outcome. So that's the rationale for doing that. So chemotherapy is extremely important in the treatment of high-grade serous ovarian cancer. Fortunately for us, it tends to be very sensitive to chemotherapy early on in the disease process. So patients with high-grade serous ovarian cancer have response rates to platinum-based chemotherapy or carboplatin, the classic drug, of about 80%. So that's what the first drug was that was used in the treatment of ovarian cancer, and then subsequent drugs have also been tested. So subsequent chemotherapy drugs have been tested as well. So paclitaxel is a taxane chemotherapy derived from the yew tree, which is a tubule inhibitor, which has also been found in addition to carboplatin to improve survival, particularly in the first-line setting. So that's why the mainstay of treatment early on is carboplatin and paclitaxel. And then there's a variety of other chemotherapy drugs that can be used beyond that, including cisplatin. One of the problems with carboplatin is some patients can become allergic to it over time. So sometimes cisplatin has to be substituted for that. Gemcitabine is another chemotherapy drug that can be used. Pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, otherwise known as Calyx, is something that's quite often used in the recurrent setting, topotecan and etoposide. So they're all chemotherapy drugs that have been shown in the recurrent setting to have response rates in ovarian cancer. One of the things that people have looked at is how do you give the chemotherapy, and does that change outcomes? So not just the drugs, but how do you actually administer them? So most chemotherapy we give intravenously, but one of the things that's been explored is giving chemotherapy intraperitoneally, so into the abdominal space. And that's been tested in a variety of different situations, but one of the situations in which it's been tested, and there are some groups in the world think that it does improve outcomes and survival, is giving it intraperitoneal after the surgery is done in combination with intravenous chemotherapy. So a combination of intravenous and intraperitoneal chemotherapy. That's really done for people who have upfront surgery and then have a special port put in place after the operation, and there are certainly people, and there's some studies that have shown that that seems to have a survival advantage for certain patients, but it's a very specialised procedure. It's not widely done in Australia. There's only a few specialised centres where it is done, and it's certainly really only done in Queensland at the Mater Hospital. So it's not something that's being done widely, but it's certainly something that in very select persons can be considered if you've got the right situation. So there's lots of new drugs that are coming out of the woodwork and being used in different contexts to just chemotherapy to try and improve outcomes in ovarian cancer. So this is where a lot of the new research is being done, and a lot of it's pretty exciting. So one of the things that people are trying to do is get away from toxicity of treatment, because anyone who's had chemotherapy will know it's quite toxic and has a range of side effects that have a very significant impact on quality of life. So a lot of the new treatments that are being looked at are looking at different parts of the molecular pathway and using new techniques that are less toxic. So one of the ones that has been found to have some efficacy for ovarian cancer is drugs that are angiogenesis inhibitors. So angiogenesis just means new blood vessel formation, so these drugs inhibit new blood vessel formation. So the theory behind developing these drugs was that a cancer needs to develop new blood vessels into it to grow to a certain size, so that if you inhibit its ability to do that, then you will inhibit the cancer growth. And that certainly has been an effective strategy in some situations in ovarian cancer. So Bevacizumab is a VEGF inhibitor, an anti-angiogenic agent that's given intravenously in combination with chemotherapy usually, although it has got some efficacy as a single agent. We're a bit limited in Australia at the moment with our access to it. So it has been shown to slightly improve progression-free survival and overall survival in combination with chemotherapy. In Australia, it's only on the PBS for people who have suboptimally debulked ovarian cancer or stage 4 cancer. So we don't have access to it in the recurrent setting. That may change in time. So there have been quite a few trials, randomised trials, that have shown that it has demonstrated small improvements in survival. And there's a range of other anti-angiogenic agents that have also been studied, including trebenanib, nintedanib, they're all impossible to say, cediranib, imatinib, pazopanib, sorafenib, and sunitinib. But they're not in clinical practice yet. Go figure, yeah. So one of the things that's important to be aware of with those drugs is they work really differently to chemotherapy, and they have a very different side effect profile. And unfortunately, even though they don't cause nausea and vomiting and problems with blood counts dropping, they can cause a range of other quite problematic side effects. They do increase the risk of gastrointestinal perforation slightly, which is obviously a very significant side effect. They do increase the risk of high blood pressure, proteinuria in the urine, bleeding, and blood clotting. So not all patients will be suitable for those drugs simply because of their other medical problems. So it's just something else to keep in mind, that it may not be for everyone. So you probably, I didn't hear all of the genetics talk, but you've at least heard a little bit about BRCA mutations and ovarian cancer. So certainly for some of the women that we see who have ovarian cancer, they do have a BRCA mutation. We know that the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes are very involved with DNA repair, and having a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 will increase lifetime risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer because of the difficulty of those cells to repair the DNA damage. We do know, however, that patients who have BRCA mutations and develop ovarian cancer have a superior outcome with respect to their ovarian cancer, because the very fact that they have a BRCA mutation makes them extremely sensitive, or makes their cancer extremely sensitive to chemotherapy. People have also now developed new types of drugs, which you've heard alluded to, specifically targeting patients who have these mutations, known as the PARP inhibitors. So these are poly-ADP ribose polymerase inhibitors. So PARPs essentially are another DNA repair pathway, and so these drugs block another common DNA repair pathway, which causes further mutations in the cancer cells and causes the cancer cells to die, essentially, because if they accumulate a certain number of mutations, it's a situation that we describe in medicine as synthetic lethality, or the cells apoptose. So there's a range of different PARP inhibitors that are out there on the market. We do have access to olaparib on the PBS for women who have got recurrent platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer and a BRCA mutation. So that is currently available in Australia for women in that specific situation. And there's a range of other drugs that have also been tried in a similar population and have been found internationally to have some efficacy. So that includes niraparib, rucaparib, talazoparib, veliparib, and a few others that don't even have names yet, but that are currently being tried. So apart from olaparib, we don't have a lot of access sort of on the PBS to these drugs, and at the moment the only women that really are having access to these drugs is women that do have confirmed BRCA germline mutations. So I'm not sure if the distinction between a germline and a somatic mutation was made, but I'll just go through that. So a germline mutation is a mutation in the DNA that you are born with. A somatic mutation is a mutation that occurs in the DNA of a tumour as it becomes genetically unstable. So even though not all women with ovarian cancer have a germline BRCA mutation, a significant percentage of them will have a BRCA mutation in their actual tumour specimen. So if you tested the blood, they wouldn't have a mutation in it, but if you test the tumour, they have a BRCA mutation in the tumour. So this is something that the ovarian cancer cells have acquired through the process of mutation. And we do think that those patients will also benefit from PARP inhibitors. And there's certainly some data in some early preliminary trials that those patients will also benefit from those drugs. The EMBRACE study is a study that is currently recruiting patients at ICON and the Royal, looking at that particular group of patients with both ovarian cancer and breast cancer. At the moment, it's a little bit hard to access those drugs though, because it's actually quite hard to do genetic testing on tumour specimens, so it's still a sort of a research proposition. So it's not something that the labs are doing routinely, but this is certainly an area of research. So this is the one that usually comes up in a clinical setting in clinic because people have seen this in the press, and there's been so much publicity about immunotherapy as being, you know, the new gold standard in the treatment of cancer. Immunotherapy as a concept is a brilliant concept, and actually is one of the reasons why I went into cancer medicine in the first place, because it just sounds so elegant. Immunotherapy is about mobilising the body's immune system to fight the cancer. So cancer cells are able to switch off the body's immune cells' ability to detect them, and these drugs, via a variety of mechanisms, basically try and switch back on the immune cells to fight the cancer. At the moment, this is still a relatively novel technique. There's a range of drugs that you may have seen reported in the press. Pembrolizumab is one of the key ones, but also nivolumab also. So at the moment, these drugs have a very proven efficacy in the treatment of melanoma, lung cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer. But at the moment, we don't have a lot of data for their use in ovarian cancer or breast cancer for that matter. And that's partly because those tumour types have lots of other treatment options that have been available. So those new drugs tend to get tested in cancers where there's not very many treatment options. So melanoma was a very difficult one to treat. It has really no response to chemotherapy. So this is why it was tested in the melanoma setting partly, and also partly because there's a little bit of evidence that occasionally patients with melanoma are able to mount their own immune response to melanoma. So there are clinical trials that are currently going on in the world and in Australia looking at using immunotherapy in the treatment of ovarian cancer. We have run one at the Mater, which has closed, and we're about to open some more. So the jury's still a little bit out with respect to ovarian cancer. Undoubtedly, there'll be some patients that do benefit. It'll be about picking those patients. So part of the issue with ovarian cancer is where it tends to go. And because it tends to spread within the peritoneum, it's quite difficult for immune cells to actually get into that space. It's not like it's the type of cancer that gets into lymph nodes as commonly, although it certainly can. So it may not prove to be quite as effective for ovarian cancer as it is for other types of cancers, but watch this space, basically. Hopefully it will, but there may be some problems with treating ovarian cancer with immunotherapy. So one of the interest areas is looking at combination treatment with chemotherapy and immunotherapy and other drugs. So that's just a sort of a timeline for FDA approval for drugs for ovarian cancer. Just looking at various things that have happened over the year, you can see that things are accelerating, so certainly more drugs are currently being approved more frequently. So what I thought I'd move on to now is just to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the clinical trials that we have coming up at the Mater Hospital. I've also had a look. We have an app actually that is freely available to anyone. There's an app called the Clinical Trials app, which you can actually just download on your phone if you are interested, which obviously some people will be. And you can do that in different states. So there's one for Queensland, and you can look at all of the clinical trials that are currently open for your cancer type in the state and where they're open. So that's a tool that we use as medical oncologists. If we have a patient in front of us and we don't have a clinical trial at our site, but we're wondering if there's something available at another site, we'll use this app to see is there a trial at a different site that may be suitable for the patient and do a referral for that. But certainly it's free to anyone to download, so you can all have a look at it yourself. Clin Trials app, so it's just CLIN TRIALS app, and I think you have to put Queensland on it as well, because when you do that, because there's one for each state in Australia. So we tend to look locally because that's obviously a little bit easier. So there's not a lot of trials open elsewhere in Brisbane at the moment, and I guess it's a little bit difficult. Some of them are only open in private practice, some are open in public practice. So we have quite a lot of trials that are coming up over the next sort of kind of 2 to 6 months. So there's a process that you go through to open a clinical trial. There's a protocol that gets developed, and then it has to go through ethics and governance, and it all takes several months. So something that some people might have found is that sometimes you get in this waiting period, waiting for a clinical trial to open, which can be a source of frustration, but that's a safety thing essentially. It's about making sure there's not any problems with the drug and making sure that everyone's in approval. There's a process called good clinical practice, which is just about trying to improve the safety of patients on clinical trials. And so every international trial has to adhere to principles of good clinical practice, which is all about trying to protect patients, give them time to have a think about whether they want to enrol, but sometimes it means it takes a little bit longer. So I just thought I'd go through what are the different types of clinical trials, because I think that's quite useful information to know if you're offered a trial. So a phase 1 trial is a first-in-human trial, essentially. So it's a drug that may have been used in monkeys or dogs or rats, and it's a first-in-human trial. So it's a drug that we think is going to be useful in a particular cancer type or for cancer, looking at using it in humans to see if there are any safety signals, as in, are there any major side effects? So it's used in a small group of people to evaluate safety. So this is how new drugs become available, but certainly they're drugs that have not got proven efficacy in a human population, and we're still waiting for that safety information. So a lot of drugs will not progress past phase 1 if there are any inherent problems with safety. So if people have adverse side effects on a phase 1 trial that are serious, then the trial is immediately shut down by a monitoring body because of safety. And so this happens sometimes. If it looks promising and safe, then it moves on to the next phase trial, which is a phase 2 trial. So these are done to study an intervention in a larger group of people to determine how effectively it works. So these are non-randomised studies usually, although not always. So that means that most people on a phase 2 trial will get the drug that is being tried. And it's a larger group of people. So you're also still looking at safety in that population, but you're trying to get more information about how effectively it works if you think it's safe, so it's progressed on. So phase 3 clinical trials are considered the gold standard clinical trial, and certainly the Australian government will generally only approve drugs that have been tested in a phase 3 setting. So these are studies to assess the efficacy of an intervention in a larger group of trial participants. So in the past, certainly they'd try and recruit thousands of patients, so 4,000 patients in the big phase 3 trials. So this is about comparing the intervention to other standard treatment to see if the intervention is better than standard treatment. And you're also collecting information about adverse effects. So we do have quite a lot of trials coming up in different clinical situations. So the neoadjuvant setting, which is those patients who can't have surgery up front, need to have some chemotherapy up front, we'll have a phase 2 study of 2 different immunotherapy drugs in combination with chemotherapy, and then those patients will go on to get immunotherapy after they've finished their chemotherapy. That's one that's coming up. Another thing that the surgical department is looking at running fairly soon is a trial of HIPEC, it's called, or heated intraperitoneal chemotherapy at the time of surgery. So that actually puts some chemotherapy in at the operation, and there was a trial that was published recently that did suggest that that provided benefit to patients. For those patients who have already had surgery and they're having adjuvant chemotherapy, so adjuvant means after surgery, there's a phase 3 study of Ovarian, which is an immunotherapy drug plus talazoparib after surgery. And then for those patients who've had their first relapse of ovarian cancer, there's a specific study looking at a drug called cyclophosphamide, followed by immunotherapy. That's not a drug that's widely used in the ovarian cancer setting. And there'll be another one that's looking at combination PARP inhibitors plus a VEGF inhibitor, the cediranib, so one of the newer ones that's a bit less toxic than bevacizumab. It starts to get more difficult with subsequent relapses. So one of the issues we see with ovarian cancer is that chemotherapy will work quite well the first time and often the second time, and then starts to become less effective over time. So for those patients, there's often sort of fewer options available. This is a study looking at the use of vinorelbine, another chemotherapy drug, in certain subtypes. So it'll be one that you have to check particularly what type of subtype of ovarian cancer they have. Once patients develop platinum resistance or platinum refractory ovarian cancer, it can be much more difficult to treat. We do have a phase 2 study that will be opening up looking at a novel treatment called prexasertib, a CHK1 inhibitor, and sort of all patients would be able to enrol onto that. We also have a phase 1 study, so our first in human trial of other combination immunotherapy drugs that may be suitable for sort of anyone with cancer. So what you'll find with the phase 1 trials is that anyone with cancer can often enrol onto a phase 1 trial to see if it has any efficacy in any cancer population. So that's just a summary of what we've got coming up. It's very difficult for me to know what other sites have coming up, simply because that's sort of subject to privacy, and until it comes up on Clinical Trials App, it's not sort of free information, but that's certainly what we've got. So the other things that I was asked to address is how can you get involved with clinical trials? Usually your medical oncologist would be looking at whether there are any clinical trial options available and suggesting if you wanted to get involved with one. It's always optional. There's always an alternative to that, but I guess it is a way of accessing some of these new therapies. In Australia, we just are a bit stuck that the PBS always takes several years to approve new drugs that are expensive. So it's a way to sometimes get access to drugs that have a proven efficacy in an international setting, but the Australian government's not yet funding them. So how to learn more, I would suggest speaking directly to your medical oncologist about what clinical trials might be suitable for you. If there's nothing at their site, they're certainly able to look at alternative sites, what's open. One of the key things is eligibility, and that's a sticking point. They can be very restrictive in who they will recruit. And that's partly the pharmaceutical companies wanting to show their drug's got the best efficacy. So unfortunately, a lot of women are not able to enrol on if they have other medical conditions, if they've ever had any other cancers in their lifetime. There's sort of a range of exclusion criteria. So, other problems with kidneys or heart. Sometimes these will exclude people, unfortunately, from clinical trials. But unless you ask and you look at the specific exclusion criteria, which is actually listed on the Clinical Trials app as well, you won't know. Okay, all right.
Mm-hmm.